There is something about Scotland in the 1980s that people who lived through it cannot forget. The grey skies and resilient spirit, the shipyards closing, the sound of simple minds echoing from every radio. And if someone lived through it, they know exactly what made that decade so challenging and so distinctive. This was a time when Scotland was facing deindustrialisation that tore through communities. Margaret Thatcher's government was closing coal mines and shipyards. The poll tax was tested on Scotland first, creating anger that would last for decades. Aberdeen was winning European trophies under Alex Ferguson. North Sea oil was booming while traditional industries died. This was the decade that gave us Taggart, Irn-Bru advertising campaigns that became cultural touchstones, massive unemployment, and a growing sense that Scotland needed more control over its own destiny. The industrial Scotland of the post-war years was disappearing, but Scottish identity was getting stronger in response. Living in Scotland meant navigating economic hardship while maintaining community bonds that held people together. Let's walk through what daily life actually felt like during that unforgettable decade. Some of this might bring back memories. Some of it might explain why the 1980s shaped modern Scotland so profoundly. Let's step into that world. Homes in Scotland. In the 1980s reflected both the era's aesthetic and the harsh economic realities. The colourful patterns of the 1970s were fading. Magnolia paint on walls became standard, a neutral backdrop for the floral patterns and pastel colours that dominated furniture and curtains. Council housing estates spread across Scottish cities and towns. These were the massive housing schemes built in the 1960s and the 1970s. Tower blocks rose above Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee, and Aberdeen. Rows of terraced houses stretched across developments in places like Easterhouse, Westerhales, and Craigmillar. Inside these homes, storage heaters lined the walls, expensive to run and never quite warm enough during Scottish winters. Single-pane windows let the cold seep through. Condensation would build up on the glass. Mold in corners was a constant battle. Scottish homes were often cold and damp despite best efforts. Living rooms had the same elements as everywhere else in the UK. A three-piece suite in browns or beiges, a television set that dominated the room, a gas fire or electric bar heater providing some warmth. Net curtains on every window, a Scottish staple for privacy while letting in what little light the grey skies provided. Kitchens were compact and functional. Formica countertops and laminate cupboards. The cooker was likely electric. The fridge was small by modern standards. Kitchens were where families gathered around Formica tables with vinyl-covered chairs. Many Scottish families were buying their council houses under Thatcher's right to buy scheme. For the first time, working-class families could own their homes. This created opportunity for some while depleting social housing stock in ways that would cause problems for decades. The weather defined Scottish life in ways people from elsewhere struggle to understand. The 1980s in Scotland meant grey skies for much of the year. Rain was not occasional, it was constant. Not heavy downpours necessarily, but persistent drizzle that soaked through clothes. Winter meant darkness. In December, daylight lasted only about 7 hours. People went to work in the dark and came home in the dark. The cold was penetrating, damp, and bitter. Temperatures hovered around freezing, and the wind made it feel colder. Summer existed, but it was brief and uncertain. A warm day meant 18 or 20 degrees. A hot day meant anything above that. People would flock outside at the first sign of sun, sitting in parks and gardens, and making the most of every moment before the clouds returned. Cars in Scotland in the 1980s were modest and practical. Ford Escorts and Vauxhall Cavaliers were everywhere. These were reliable, affordable cars built in British factories. Rust was a constant problem. The damp climate and salt on winter roads meant cars deteriorated quickly. Parking in cities was easier than it would become. Traffic existed, but was manageable. Glasgow and Edinburgh had their busy areas, but nothing like the congestion of later decades. Public transport was how many people got around. Buses connected housing estates to city centres. Train scenes ran between cities and into the Highlands. The orange SPT buses in Glasgow were iconic. Edinburgh had its maroon and white Lothian buses. Waiting at bus stops in the rain was a daily experience for thousands of Scots. The economy in Scotland in the 1980s was brutal. The industries that had employed generations were dying. Shipbuilding on the Clyde, once the pride of Scotland, was collapsing. The great shipyards that had built vessels for the world were closing one by one. The miners' strike from 1984 to 1985 was devastating for Scottish mining communities. When the National Coal Board announced pit closures, miners went on strike for nearly a year. Communities stood together. Soup kitchens were organised. Families struggled without wages. The strike ended in defeat, and the pits closed anyway. Unemployment soared above 15% in some areas. Entire communities that had depended on a single industry found themselves with nothing. Young people left school with no prospects. The queue at the job centre was a weekly ritual for thousands. The contrast between the economic devastation and the North Sea oil boom was stark. Aberdeen transformed into the oil capital of Europe. American and Norwegian companies brought money and jobs. Workers flew out to oil rigs for weeks at a time, earning wages that seemed impossible elsewhere in Scotland. But that wealth stayed concentrated in the northeast, while the Central Belt struggled. Before we continue with the culture and resilience that defined Scotland in this era, if you are enjoying this look back at how people really lived and want to explore more decades and places, consider subscribing. There are so many more stories about how Scots built the life we know today. Margaret Thatcher's most hated policy was the poll tax, and Scotland was used as the testing ground. Introduced in Scotland in 1989, a year before England and Wales, the community charge replaced the rates system. Everyone paid the same amount, regardless of their ability to pay. The policy created fury. Mass non-payment campaigns spread, and demonstrations filled the streets. The sense that Scotland was being used for experimentation by a government it had not voted for deepened resentment toward Westminster. The poll tax became a symbol of everything Scots felt was wrong with the Union. Television in Scotland in the 1980s meant BBC Scotland and STV. Scottish programming was limited, but it was important to identity. Taggart launched in 1983, and it became an institution. The Glasgow-set detective show gave Scotland a gritty crime drama that felt authentically Scottish. Reporting Scotland delivered the evening news. High Road was the Scottish soap opera set in a fictional village. Take the High Road showed Scottish life with recognisable accents and situations. Football was religion in Scotland in the 1980s. Celtic and Rangers dominated. Their rivalry was as much about sectarianism as sport. Rangers won multiple league titles. Celtic had their own successes. The Old Firm derby stopped the country. Pubs filled, families divided, streets emptied as everyone watched. Aberdeen also left a deep mark in that decade. Under manager Alex Ferguson, Aberdeen won the Scottish League, Scottish Cups, and remarkably, the European Cup Winners' Cup in 1983, defeating Real Madrid. For a provincial Scottish club to win in Europe was extraordinary. Ferguson became a legend before moving to Manchester United. Dundee United reached the UEFA Cup semi-final. Scottish football was punching above its weight, and it mattered deeply to people's sense of pride during economically difficult times. Music from Scotland in the 1980s was thriving. Simple Minds became one of the biggest bands in the world. Don't You Forget About Me from the Breakfast Club soundtrack made them international stars. Big Music and Belfast Child showcased their anthemic sound. The Proclaimers emerged with their distinctive sound and strong Scottish accents. I'm Gonna Be 500 Miles and Sunshine on Leith became anthems. They did not sand down their Scottishness for commercial success. Deacon Blue formed in Glasgow and released Raintown in 1987. The album captured something about urban Scottish life. Songs like Dignity and Real Gone Kid resonated with Scottish audiences. Aztec Camera, Orange Juice, and the indie scene around Glasgow's Postcard Records label created jangly guitar pop that influenced bands across Britain. Edwyn Collins and Roddy Frame were writing sophisticated pop songs. Fish and Marillion had a following in Scotland. Wet 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 were massive by the end of the decade. Scottish artists were succeeding without losing their identity. Shopping in Scotland in the 1980s meant going to the city centre or to the new shopping centres appearing on the outskirts. Glasgow had Argyle Street and Buchanan Street. Edinburgh had Princes Street. Aberdeen had Union Street. These were where people shopped on Saturdays. Department stores like Fraser's, John Lewis, and Debenhams anchored the city centre. Marks and Spencer was where middle-class families bought clothes and food. C&A provided affordable fashion. British home stores sold household goods. New shopping centres were emerging. The Gyle in Edinburgh opened in 1989. These indoor spaces, with parking lots, represented modern shopping, though nothing like the massive centres of later decades. Co-op stores were everywhere in working-class areas. Small supermarkets were where people did their daily shopping. The dividend number system, where members got money back, was still in use. Local shops, bakers, butchers, and newsagents were on every street. Greggs bakery shops were spreading. A steak bake or a sausage roll from Greggs was affordable food. Irn-Bru was the national drink. The advertising slogan said, "Made in Scotland from girders." Every corner shop sold it, and every household had it. The bright orange fizzy drink was as Scottish as anything. Childhood in Scotland in the 1980s was spent largely outdoors despite the weather. Kids played in streets, in parks, in the waste ground between housing blocks. Football was constant, jumpers for goalposts, playing until dark. Schools had strict discipline. The belt, a leather strap used for corporal punishment, was still in use until it was banned in 1987. Teachers maintained order through fear. School uniforms were mandatory and enforced. Scottish education was different from England. The system was separate, with different exams and structures. It used O grades and higher rather than O levels and A levels. There was pride in the Scottish education system's reputation. Hogmanay was bigger than Christmas for many Scottish families. New Year's Eve meant parties and first footing at midnight, carrying coal and whiskey to neighbours' doors for luck. Staying up past midnight was normal for children on Hogmanay, when it never was otherwise. What defined Scotland in the 1980s was resilience in the face of devastating economic change. Communities that had built their identities around industries watched those industries die. Unemployment crushed opportunities. The poll tax tested Scottish patience with Westminster rule. But Scots maintained strong communities. Families looked out for each other. Humour remained dark and self-deprecating but constant. The sense of Scottish identity grew stronger in response to feeling ignored by a London-based government. The decade saw the birth of movements that would lead to devolution. It saw Scottish music and culture celebrated internationally. It saw communities fighting to survive when everything seemed stacked against them. For those who lived through Scotland in the 1980s, it was a time of grey skies and economic hardship, but also of fierce pride and unbreakable community bonds. The Scotland of the 1980s was struggling, but it was also refusing to give up. For those with memories of this difficult but defining era, there is always more history to explore.